The first day of 1777 in Princeton, New Jersey was mild. It was thawing out the ground that had been frozen for days, turning the streets and roads into rivers of mud. During the last 48 hours, regiment after regiment of British soldiers had descended upon the village of Princeton, marching south from New York and New Brunswick down the post road. By the end of this first day of the year, some 10,000 British troops had assembled in this tiny college town. German Jaegers, Hessian Grenadiers, the Black Watch Regiment of the Highlanders, elite corps of light infantry and dragoons, and of course, the well-trained, well-disciplined, and well-paid British soldier, thousands of them. Five days earlier, American General George Washington had made his famous crossing of the ice-choked Delaware River. Then, on the morning of December 26, 1776, he and his army of ragtag patriots captured the Trenton garrison. Expecting a swift and severe British counterattack, Washington then took nearly 900 British prisoners and his own army back across the Delaware that same day. Meanwhile, in New York, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in North America, William Howe, couldn't believe it. Not only had his troops at Trenton surrendered, but the Hessian garrison 25 miles north of Trenton at New Brunswick had fled their post, leaving the entire eastern bank of the Delaware open to the Americans. And to make matters worse, Howe learned that on December 29th, Washington had made a second crossing back into New Jersey, meaning that the entire strip along the Delaware River was now in American hands. Responding to the threat that Washington and his men now posed as they camped on the south side of the Assunpink Creek, just adjacent to Trenton, Howe congregated British troops 12 miles north of Trenton in Princeton. This small village of 60 to 80 houses had been under British occupation since early December, where the garrison occupied both private and public property, making no distinction between properties belonging to patriots, loyalists, or the pacifist Quakers. The British burned fences and crops and pilfered livestock, wagons, blankets, household goods, and supplies. They built fires in the Presbyterian church and burned the pews to fuel them. They stabled their horses in Nassau Hall, the oldest building on the Princeton campus. And now, this already desolated, terrorized town received thousands more British soldiers who sought their shelter in barns, sheds, outbuildings, anywhere and everywhere across this tiny New England town. Howe put Lord Charles Cornwallis in charge of the soldiers at Princeton. And on January the 2nd, 1777, Cornwallis ordered his British troops to march toward Trenton, hoping to force Washington, who was camped on the south side of the Assunpink Creek, adjacent to the town of Trenton, to engage in a full-scale and vintage British battle, which both men knew the Americans could not win. But Washington, knowing Cornwallis was en route to Trenton, dispatched a detachment of Continental Rifles up to the Trenton-Princeton Road to harass the British advance. Finally, arriving in Trenton shortly before nightfall, Cornwallis ordered his men to attack. 3 times the British charged the bridges that led to the other side of the Assunpink, and 3 times they were repelled, taking heavy, bloody losses in the process. Night was falling, and believing that Washington was trapped between the British soldiers now in Trenton, the remaining British soldiers at Princeton, and the Delaware River at his back, Cornwallis postponed any further attack until daybreak. "We've got the old fox now," he said. "We'll bag him in the morning."
I believe that this nation should commit itself.
Meanwhile, over the Assunpink in the American camp, Washington's soldiers understood their predicament, but they didn't seem to let it bother them. History records that a young Rhode Island veteran of war, a Stephen Olney, was deeply troubled by their most desperate situation. But when he asked a fellow soldier what he thought their chances were, the soldier shrugged off Olney's concern and answered cheerfully, "I don't know. The Lord must help us." Instead of worrying, most of the exhausted men slept. It was at this moment, caught in the teeth of their enemy, that a small miracle occurred. While the men slept, a north wind came up. Temperatures dropped, and the roads froze with snow and ice and mud, forming a surface as hard as pavement. It was Major General Arthur St. Clair who gave Washington an absurd idea. What if, by once again taking advantage of the cover of darkness and the good solid state of the roads, the Americans were to march on a wide sweep north? This would be roughly parallel to the post road, putting the Americans at Cornwallis's rear and able to attack the small British garrison left at Princeton. This was an exceedingly dangerous plan that put the American army in the heart of enemy-occupied territory. But in truth, Washington had few alternatives. He didn't want a general battle, which meant certain defeat. He didn't want to retreat back across the Delaware, since that could snuff out any flickering hopes of colonial victory that were kindled at the Battle of Trenton. And though the march on Princeton might prove a disaster, one thing I was sure of, Washington later reported to Congress, this would avoid the appearance of a retreat. After Washington and his men committed to this plan, orders were whispered throughout the ranks, and the sleeping men were brought to their feet. Groping for their weapons, they were told to be very quiet. Wheels of the carriage were muffled with rags. Officers tried to herd their men into formation and move them out in small detachments, but Washington's spontaneous decision created too much confusion. "No one knew what the general meant to do," said one captain. It was 3 hours before most of the troops were underway. Meanwhile, Washington ordered 400 men to stay behind to keep campfires burning and picks and shovels moving, to deceive the British into believing that the Americans were digging in for daytime battle. But so great was the emphasis on secrecy that none of these men knew where their comrades had gone. Their orders were simply to withdraw at daybreak and follow the army's tracks. And if they couldn't follow the tracks, they were to return to their homes in the nearby counties. Washington marched his troops in 2 columns throughout that cold, dark night. As the Americans approached Princeton, Colonel Charles Mawhood is leaving Princeton and heading south to reinforce Cornwallis at Trenton. He has with him 400 British soldiers, grenadiers, Scottish Highlanders, and dragoons. Mahood spots Nathaniel Greene's force across the way, quickly assesses the situation, and attacks the Americans across a rising field covered with the orchard, house, and barns of a Quaker farmer named William Clark. Kneeling behind a fence, Mahood's men opened fire first. After a vicious, bloody firefight, Mahood orders bayonets fixed and breaks an American brigade led by General Hugh Mercer. The British corner Mercer, thinking that they have Washington himself, and they begin to taunt and stab him, leaving the American general for dead. The arrival of a force led by Cadwalader, aided by a pair of 4-pound cannons, slows the British onslaught, but even these efforts are not enough, and Cadwalader's men soon begin to give way. But it is at this moment that Washington himself arrives on the spot, exposing himself again to musket fire from both sides. The general rallies his men with the cry, "Parade with us, my brave fellows!" Heartened by his example, many of the American militia did rally, and after turning back 2 successive waves of Americans, the British regiment could no longer hold. Taking heavy casualties and having lost most of his officers, Mahood ordered a retreat. Intoxicated by the sight of the redcoats' retreat, Washington led their pursuit, yelling exuberantly, "It's a fine fox chase, my boys!" as he galloped out of sight. Meanwhile, the Clarks' quiet, peaceful farm has been transformed into a slaughterhouse and a hospital. Left in the possession of the Americans more than 100 casualties, most of those British, lay scattered about, groaning, dying, and dead, said one eyewitness. And Mrs. Clark herself, recovering from a miscarriage and too weak to struggle to her feet, had been carried to the cellar by her husband and nurse, bed and all, when shots from the battle began coming through the Clark farmhouse windows. For the men who battled on Clark's farm, the fight was over. But not so for the men attached to Sullivan's column who had been halted on the road to Princeton. What was left of Mahood's regiment moved into position to defend Princeton, while the British 40th Regiment, still in Princeton, moved out from the college to help defend the town. Led by Mahood, the British made their stand at Frog Hollow Ravine, but with a portion of their army already defeated at Clark's farm, the British put up little resistance when Sullivan's army began to attack. Those who did not surrender were chased back into Princeton, where they made a stand within the strong stone walls of Nassau Hall. But before these soldiers could organize, Americans enveloped the building, and a young Alexander Hamilton's battery fired a round of shot, one of which is said to have decapitated the portrait of King George II in the prayer halls. A white flag soon appeared, and the British surrendered. The Battle of Princeton was over, and Washington's army had virtually destroyed 3 of England's finest regiments, although they had lost many irreplaceable officers, especially the greatly lamented Mercer, who died after 9 pain-filled days. The Americans also captured a wagon train of supplies, a fact Washington chose not to emphasize in his report to Congress, lest they use it as an excuse for not providing his soldiers with much-needed equipment. Following Princeton, Washington would have liked to attack New Brunswick to capture an undefended storehouse of arms and supplies, but his men were reaching the limits of their endurance. Many hadn't eaten for more than a day, and others had slept only a couple of hours in nearly 3 days. Moreover, encumbered with the prisoners, wagons, and supplies captured in Princeton, the American army, for once, could not be expected to outmarch its pursuers. Reluctantly, Washington turned north at Kingston and began a retreat executed in stages over the next few days to the safety of the Washung Mountains around Morristown. Too worried about his supplies to follow Washington, Cornwallis drove his men all night to reach New Brunswick. There they got little rest, for they were routed out hours before dawn each morning to stand guard. Cornwallis, having learned the hard way about his opponent's penchant for dawn attacks, was taking no chances.